Questions 21 to 31. Let's read the blurb. The passage is adapted from Kevin N. Lallen, Darwin's Unfinished Sympathy, How Culture Made the Human Mind, 2017. Animal behavior researchers have defined teaching as behavior targeted only at a naive observer, and that helps the naive observer acquire a skill or knowledge at some cost to the teacher. So obviously this is a definition, and we'll keep that in mind. It's technically teaching. So the first paragraph really just gives backgrounds about these meerkats, and they live somewhere in the African desert. Some of the main points here are that line 4, the pups, the babies, they're almost entirely reliant on food provisioned by older group members known as the helpers. But interestingly, line 7, by 3 months of age, the same youngsters have become entirely self-sufficient at feeding, and they can do all sorts of stuff. So obviously you should be thinking, oh, how did they get from that point to that point? Does it have to do with something with teaching? And then in line 11, they do say, recent work shows that the helpers facilitate, makes easier, the transition to nutritional independence. So helpers facilitate that by gradually introducing pups to live prey. So that's the background. And then we mentions these researchers, Alex Thornton and Catherine McAuliffe. What does it say? They set out to establish whether this process meets the definition of teaching. So this is like their research question. This is what they want to get an answer to. And then in order to do that, it says this required them to determine whether the transfer of live prey by helpers occurred solely in the presence of the pups at some cost to the adults and led to the youngsters learning about food. So those are the details of what they want to figure out. Next paragraph starts off with some more background information. It says, what do the adults do? They typically kill or disable the mobile prey before giving them to the pups. And as the pups grow older, they're increasingly given intact prey, stings and all. And here's the important part that is going to influence their methodology. It says they establish that whether or not the helpers modify the prey through sting removal hung critically on the sound of the pups' begging calls, which changes with age. And it says the researchers played recordings of the begging calls of old pups to groups with young pups, which led them to bring back live prey. So old pups led to live prey, which makes sense from what they said before. Young pups made them bring back dead prey, which also makes sense. So the younger the pup, the more likely it is to be dead. And here are the results. The experimental manipulation demonstrates that the helpers normally adjusted their behavior to the age and hence the competence of the pup. And in the next column, they also mention that this provisioning strategy incurs costs. Remember, costs were part of the original research question back from lines 15 to 20. Why? Because there's a lot of time spent monitoring the pups. But line 50, they said the strategy creates opportunities for pups to acquire hunting skills. So there's costs, and then there's obviously benefits that are listed here. And the next paragraph says, here, they were able to provide experimental evidence that the helper's behavior promoted skill acquisition. So this is probably like the second claim. And then that's explained because it says that for the pups that were given opportunities to handle live scorpions, they outperformed them. The ones who were given dead scorpions, which kind of makes sense because it's more challenging. And then it says, this is probably more like the conclusion. The difference between results and conclusions is sometimes not exactly a fine line, but I'm just kind of calling it that. It says they demonstrated that meerkat helpers' behavior was a genuine example of animal teaching, which is an answer to their research question. And then some implications at the bottom. It says, in the long run, adults benefit by reducing the cost of provisioning through hastening the time to independence, as well as through increased pup survival. So basically, this strategy of teaching actually has benefits in the long run. So overall in the passage, there's some background. They ask a research question. They describe the experiment, and then they talk about the results. And then at the very end, they speculate as to why this happens. So typical format for a science passage in the SAT, things that you want to be keep an eye out for are obviously the research question, the methodology, the results, and the conclusions. And let's look at the questions. Question 21, the main purpose of the passage is to, so given that there's no direct place in the passage that we have to look, let's just look at the answers. Raise questions about meerkat behavior that future research may be able to answer. So they definitely raise questions, but I think they do more than that. They also talk about an experiment and give some answers. So this sort of sounds like, oh, we're just raising questions and they have to do research in the future. So A is not going to work. B, present a series of studies about meerkat pups that contradicts previous research into their behavior. So definitely not a series of studies. I think this was one study, but certainly there's no mention of previous research, I don't think, and so it wouldn't contradict it either. So B is going to be out. C, describe research that has furthered scientific understanding of meerkat behavior. This one seems like a safe answer because they do talk about this experiment and we got some answers from it, so it did further understanding of their behavior. D, address the limitations of applying research on adult meerkats to the behavior of pups. This is like saying that they did research on adults and now they're making conclusions about the children as a result. That actually happens a lot in medicine with human beings, but clearly that wasn't what was going on because the research was actually on adults and pups together, and so their conclusions were valid for pups because they were using them directly. So C is going to be the best answer for 21. 22, lines 1 through 11 mainly serve 2. So looking at it briefly, remember that lines 1 to 11 started off by introducing meerkats. They talk about how they're reliant on food, they're helpers, and then they become independent. And so all the way up to 11, like we said before, it's pretty much giving the setting or background information. And then after that, they start talking about some research, recent work shows, and then they get into the research question in line 14. Looking at the answers, choice A provides background information on meerkats and their young. So yeah, that's a safe answer, definitely background information. B, acknowledge the particular difficulties involved in meerkat research, not in lines 1 to 11 if there are difficulties at all. Choice C, give an overview of the studies discussed in the rest of the passage. So lines 1 to 11, no mention of studies. They first mention a study right here. It's not even a study, it's really just recent work. So it's kind of a sort of a mention of a study, but not really directly. And choice D, pose a research question that will be answered in the rest of the passage. So they do pose a research question, but not in lines 1 to 11. Remember, that comes right over here from like lines 15 to 17. So A is going to be the best answer for 22. 23, which choice best supports the idea that adult helpers are capable of assessing individual pup skills and adjusting the training they provide based on that assessment? All right, so we got to look through each of them and just keep in mind a simple version of the question. We're looking for something that shows adults judging or assessing the kids and then changing their training based on that judgment. Choice A, 14 to 17. Cambridge University researchers Alex Thornton and Catherine McAuliffe set out to establish whether this process meets the definition of teaching. So again, this was their research goal, has nothing to do with the adult meerkats teaching or assessing the kid meerkats. So A is out. B, 24 to 26. Scorpions are often disabled by removing the sting, allowing pups to interact safely with the live prey. So again, nothing here about parents assessing their kids. Choice C, 40 to 45. Indeed, the adults exhibited considerable sensitivity to the performance of the pups, nudging prey items if the pups ignored them, retrieving escaped prey, and modifying the prey some more if pups were struggling. So yeah, definitely. So when it says modifying the prey, that's showing that they're making changes to their teaching. And then in line 41 where it says exhibiting sensitivity to the performance, that's kind of making an assessment. So choice C seems like it'll work. Let's check choice D, 49 to 51. However, the strategy creates opportunities for the pups to acquire hunting skills. So no assessment and no change in behavior. So for 23, the best choice is going to be C. Question 24 is used in line 16. Meets most nearly means. So let's look at it before we look at the answers. Start over here. Cambridge University researchers Alex Thornton and Catherine McAuliffe set out to establish whether this process meets the definition of teaching. So they're saying whether this process, what's a good guess word, falls under, whether this process, is considered under, or whether this process satisfies the definition of teaching. They're basically saying, does this process count as teaching? So let's see what they got. Does the process find the definition of teaching? Doesn't make sense. Does the process join the definition of teaching? That's a little weird. Does the process encounter, which means to meet the definition of teaching? It's actually funny if you define encounter as meet. You can use the word meet. It's like not great, but it's okay. Choice D, whether this process fulfills the definition of teaching. So yeah, fulfill is closest to what our guess words were. Does this process like satisfy or fall under the definition? So choice D is the best one. Question 25, as used in line 54, promoted most nearly means, so another vocab. Start at the beginning of the paragraph. 52, Thornton and McAuliffe were also able to provide experimental evidence that the helper's behavior promoted skill acquisition. So behavior promoted skill acquisition. So what do we mean that it promoted? It probably means that the behavior helped in some way skill acquisition, or it made it easier, like facilitated or encouraged. Either way, there's a positive relationship between the helper's behavior and the skill opposition or acquisition. So let's look at the answers. So the behavior promoted skills. Behavior elevated skills. That's okay. That implies that the skills were kind of already there and they got a little bit better. There might be a better answer. The behavior fostered skill acquisition. Yeah, this is closer to promoted because we want to say that it encouraged or helped the acquisition, and that's really what foster means. So A is better than, or B is better than A. C, it announced skill acquisition. So yeah, that's totally different. We're not saying that the teaching announced it, or the behavior rather. D, the behavior recommended skill acquisition. No, that's also a totally different definition. So between A and B, B is definitely the better choice. Question 26, according to the passage, meerkat pups who played with living but harmless versions of the meerkat's usual prey were. So the answer here is C. I'm going to explain it first because it's in a very specific part of the passage. It's the one that we just read, 52 and onward. So let's go back to it. So we just read the sentence that it said that there is evidence that the helper's behavior promoted skill acquisition. Specifically, how did that happen? Keep reading. Line 54, pups that were artificially given opportunities to handle live stingless scorpions subsequently outperformed the siblings that had been given dead scorpions, showing that the opportunity to practice on disabled but live scorpions facilitates skill acquisition. And by the way, this facilitate is also a parallel to the promoting skill acquisition. So that's actually another clue for the previous question. Regardless, here, this is the evidence for choice C, because notice what it says. More skillful at handling intact prey than were pups who were provided with dead prey. So let's look at the other answers. Choice A, they were less able to discern when prey was dangerous than were pups who encountered intact prey. So I'm assuming intact means live. I don't think there's really a direct comparison between the ones who played with living but harmless versus the ones who preyed with intact. So I'm going to say that might be true, but there's really no evidence for it. And if you guys find something, please comment below. B, they were less likely to consume enough to survive than pups who were provided with dead prey. So yeah, I don't remember anything from the passage that talked about the amount that they ate, whether it was enough for them to survive. Just a different topic. Choice D, more likely to lose their prey than were pups who encountered intact prey. Also, I don't think there was any discussion about them losing their prey in the passage. So all that means is that C is going to be the best answer. 27, which statement about the provisioning of prey to meerkat pups can most reasonably be inferred from the passage? So let's glance at them real quickly. 27 and 28 should be done together. Typical young meerkat pups who are being instructed do not immediately consume prey that has been provided by adults. I don't remember anything about how much time it takes them to consume the prey after they get it from the adult. So we'll keep an eye on A, but I don't think it sounds right. B, young meerkat pups can safely interact with prey that has been provided by a helper only after the helper has killed it. This seems a little bit restrictive. I mean, I think with the example with the scorpions, if they took off their tail and it was still alive, then presumably they could safely interact with it. So I don't think B is going to be the right answer, but again, we want to look at the answers or the evidence before we decide. C, as an element of the training process, helper meerkats provide a greater variety of prey to younger pups than they do to older pups. Greater variety, I don't really know about that also. Obviously, they kill it to a greater or lesser extent, or disable it, depending on how old they are. But again, B and C doesn't really seem right. Choice D, when pups are still learning, direct experience with manipulating prey takes precedence over direct experience with acquiring prey. That might be right. There was some discussion about that towards the end. So it seems like D is probably the best choice, but we do want to look at the evidence. And the questions we want to keep in mind as we're looking at the answer, if we're considering A and D, is do they not immediately consume the prey, or does experience with manipulating take place or precedence over experience with acquiring? 11 to 14. Recent work shows that the helpers facilitate this transition to nutritional independence by gradually introducing the pups to live prey. So the key is gradually introducing them. Neither A, B, C, or D really goes along with that, so that's not going to work. 21 to 24. Adult meerkats usually consume prey immediately, but when young pups are present, they typically kill or disable mobile prey items before carrying them to a begging pup. So this does talk about the time. Let's see if that matches up with what we said. In choice A, it says typically young meerkat pups who are being instructed do not immediately consume prey that has been provided by adults. So it's kind of off. The comparison in the passage, it's really just saying adults usually consume it immediately, but when they're giving it to the pups, they often kill or disable. This isn't really talking about how quickly it takes the pups to consume the prey. So you might have gotten confused with B and A, but I think it's still a little bit off. Choice C, 52 to 54. Thornton and McAuliffe were also able to provide experimental evidence that the helper's behavior promoted skill acquisition. So that's a very general statement. I don't think it really backs up any of these answers because the answers are all very specific. D, 62 to 67. A clue as to why helpers teach is found with the observation that pups rarely find mobile prey items themselves. Helpers can therefore actively facilitate pups' acquisition of handling skills by giving them otherwise unavailable opportunities to practice handling prey. This does seem to echo answer choice D, because notice it says two things. Pups rarely find mobile prey themselves, and then they're given the opportunity to handle the prey. So looking back at choice D, it says when pups are still learning, direct experience with manipulating, again that's handling in the passage, takes precedence over direct experience with acquiring the prey. And acquiring is obviously another word for finding, which is what it said in the passage. So this is what the SAT likes to do. They a lot of times they'll rephrase something that's said directly in the passage. And so choice D is the best one here, and it goes along with choice D in 27. Question 29, according to figure 1, in groups with young pups, approximately what proportion of prey is provided intact when the helper meerkats hear an old pup's call? So this is the first time I'm actually looking at the graph. I think that's probably the best strategy. Figure 1, it says prey provisioning by helper meerkats in response to the begging calls of pups. So we've got two groups with young pups, groups with old pups. So the question is asking, in the groups with young pups, that's the one on the left, what proportion of the prey is provided intact when the helper meerkats hear an old pup's call? So groups with young pups, that's the left, and when they hear an old pup's call, what proportion is intact? That's about 0.45, that would be my guess, because it's right in between 4 and 5. So going back, and that's going to be choice C. Remember, on the reading section, these graph questions are not going to be very hard. It's usually like, can you read the graph? Question 30, the information in figure 1 best supports which claim made in the passage about helper meerkats and the prey that they provide? So looking again very quickly at this, what is it basically saying? The left graph is saying the proportion that's left intact, meaning alive. So in groups with young pups, if they hear an old pup call, it would suggest that they're mature, and that's why there's a higher percent left alive. If they hear a young pup call, it probably means they need to be killed. On the right side, in the groups with old pups, notice they changed the meaning on the y-axis. This is the proportion of prey left dead. So even in the old pups, if they hear a young pup cry, they're going to think, oh, we need to kill this because the young ones don't have that much experience. And if they hear an old pup cry, then they're not going to kill it as much. So just keep that in mind as we look at the answer choices. It seems to be that the bar graphs and the height is determined solely by the call and of what they heard, and not what the actual group is, which is interesting. Choice A, in groups with young pups, that would be on the left, meerkat helpers will reposition prey if the pups ignore it initially. So we don't get this repositioning really from the passage at all, so I think that's what makes A wrong. Choice B, in groups with old pups, meerkat helpers are more likely to provide dead prey in response to the calls of young pups than in response to the calls of old pups. So yeah, groups with old pups here, they're more likely to provide prey in response to calls with young, that's higher than the calls with old. So it's like 0.7 to 0.2. So choice B does make sense. C, if young pups allow prey to escape, helpers will retrieve the prey further, and further reduce its ability to escape before returning it. I think this is going a little far. I don't really know what happens if the young pups allow the prey to escape. It seems like there's some adaptation here and then reduce its ability further, but I don't think that was really mentioned in the passage. It's certainly not supported by figure 1. D, when pups are allowed to practice on disabled prey, they become more adept at handling intact prey. That probably was backed up in the passage, so we can say that this is true, but not really mentioned, or not really backed up by the idea in figure 1 or the data in figure 1. Figure 1 is basic, it's very basic, so you can't really get either C or D from that, regardless of whether it's true. Question 31, according to figure 2, the proportion of prey found by a meerkat pup is closest to 0.2 when the pup is. Let's look at the graph. So very quickly, this is the acquisition by age. We've got the age on the bottom, and we've got the proportion of prey found by the pups themselves. So it seems like as they get older, they find more by themselves. So that kind of makes sense. Back to the question, the proportion found when the pup is closest, the proportion of prey found is closest to 0.2 when the pup is. So 0.2 is over here, and we just go straight across, and the pup is about, 71, 72 days old. So the answer is going to be choice C.